edition of Grace Excels, I want to look at John chapter 8, and it's going to be verses 1 through 11. However, it has a historic problem in the original manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts, that a section that I'm going to focus on is actually questionable whether it should be at this particular place in John's Gospel or elsewhere. Others have even suggested it's in the Gospel of Luke. And in the flow of the text, I wanted to be able to illustrate or highlight, and that's the attempt of my first portion of this video, is to demonstrate that as you look at the flow of a narrative, and if you can see the circumstances of the narrative as John has written, does it make sense? And we're not sitting in judgment of it. We have this text in front of us, and the editors have given us a benefit of noting where there's a questionable inclusion. It's here in this little, starting at chapter 7, verse 53. I mentioned this at the end of the chapter 7 study, that I left hanging, verse 53, everyone went to his home at the conclusion of the Feast of Tabernacles. That was the time period, because Jesus stood up on the last day, the great day of the feast. So this is the sequel to that. And then this bracket ends down here at the end of verse 11. So the question is what to do with this story. It's a well-known story. It's the woman caught in adultery and Jesus writing on the ground, and all of these accusers subsequent to his challenge are going to leave, and it's just the two of them, Jesus and this woman, that are left. This whole story, I'm not challenging that it's not true, that it's not inspired. The question is, does it belong here in this particular section of John's Gospel? Holding to the text as it's presented, I want to go ahead and study it, but I want to illustrate that as you study a narrative or consider a narrative, notice the flow of the narrative and contextual clues would seem to indicate that this actually may belong elsewhere in another portion of Scripture. But where it is, I'm going to accept it. But to illustrate, I wanted to show what I see, and you can agree or disagree, obviously. But just going back for contextual notice, the officers then came to the chief priests and Pharisees and said to him, "Why did you not bring him?" The officers answered, "Never has a man spoken this way, the way this man speaks." And the Pharisees then answered him, "You've not been led astray, have you? No one of the rulers of the Pharisees have believed in him, has he? But this crowd, which does not know the law, is accursed." Nicodemus, he who came to him before, being one of them, said to them, "Our law does not judge a man unless it hears from him and knows what he is doing, does it?" And then they answer him back, "You are not also from Galilee, are you? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee." And we don't hear anything from Nicodemus. It's just silence, maybe fearful silence. He doesn't argue back. Now, as it turns out, this idea, our law, has been met early with the challenge about circumcision and about healing a whole man on the Sabbath, which is what Jesus did back in chapter 5. He's referred to it again in chapter 7, and now the reference to our law. And so when it works for them, they're going to quote their law. That seems to recommend then that this dispute between the leaders, the Pharisees, and Nicodemus is spilling over into the continuation, so that in verse 53, everyone went to his home. Then the next verse, verse 1, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again into the temple. And he came again. This is where this whole discussion had been, although we see no discussion here with Jesus. It's only about the Pharisees and this question, why didn't the officers bring Jesus? And then the interview with Nicodemus and the challenge. So now we're back to Jesus teaching in the temple. He came into the temple, and all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the center of the court, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act." Now, in the law of Moses, the context would indicate that this is the focal point. The law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say? Very similar to their challenging Nicodemus. What about you? You're not from Galilee, are you? Search and see that arises. So the challenge is, what do you say? Now, what's interesting is verse 6 is their motivation. They were saying this, testing him, so that they might have grounds for accusing him. But verse 6 is divided. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. But when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and he said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Verse 8. Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones. And he was left alone, and the woman where she was, in the center of the court. This is a very significant statement by John, because the center of the court is mentioned up here in verse 3. The focal point here is to note that she's been subjected to everyone's attention, the humiliation of the woman caught in the very act of adultery. Jesus, now straightening up, said to her, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "I do not condemn you either. Go, from now on, sin no more." And the story ends with just the two of them, Jesus and the woman, in a brief conversation. Everyone else has left. The scribes and the Pharisees brought her. They challenged the law. They were doing it to test him. Jesus responds by writing on the ground twice. And whatever it was that he wrote, his one word, "He who is without sin among you," and suddenly everyone leaves. Not suddenly, but there was a sequence, the oldest and then the younger. And then it's just the two of them, Jesus and the woman. So if we consider the text, we have the leaders up here at the end of chapter 7 talking to the officers and even disputing among themselves as Nicodemus, one of the Pharisees, challenges gently about our law. And then we have at the end of this section, Jesus and the woman. Going to the very next verse, verse 12 of chapter 8, then Jesus again spoke to them. Now, this is where it seems to be a bit of an awkward change in the flow of the story. Because the question is, who is them? Jesus again spoke to them. Everyone's left. He was left alone and the woman. So the text would seem, in my judgment, to read, then Jesus again spoke to her, and then he addresses this next great I am statement, I am the light of the world. But there doesn't seem to be any context for this change, neither in terms of who or what he's describing. It doesn't fit with the light of the world. So as we go all the way down, and we're going to skip over the rest of this because it's a dispute about his testimony and whether his testimony is true because he lacks witnesses, which is interesting because he doesn't challenge the men who brought this woman that they evidently were sufficient witnesses, and he doesn't challenge that they've not fulfilled the obligation of every fact being confirmed by two witnesses. But by getting to the end of this section, I want to drop down to verse 20. These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. John chapter 7 ends without any dispute around the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, and Jesus is in Jerusalem. Even though he was delayed, he arrived at the midst of the feast. He's remained. What this earlier passage, this passage in question, suggests that Jesus departs the city, goes to the Mount of Olives, and then he comes back to the temple. So we see John describe that he comes back to the temple and describes that he was teaching them. It seems redundant in verse 20 for him to say almost the same thing. These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple. In other words, this substantiates for me that if we were to take this section out, and I'm just going to copy it and delete it, and now it would read more logically and smoothly that what the discussion had been with the dispute of the Pharisees and the rulers with the officers and Nicodemus, Jesus picks up the conversation that he's been silent while they were talking about that. He now rejoins the challenge that he spoke to them, either his followers or other people, but not the woman. So it would make sense to look at the passage, and some of the ancient manuscripts actually did this very thing. They took out what is in our Bible, John chapter 7, verse 53, down to chapter 8, verse 11. And this is how I would look at this story, by removing that. However, for the sake of the study, what I want to do is keep this section in there and then look at it. So I'm actually going to reverse myself here now and delete the section that came before and after, because I've removed the context. I'm going to leave this in here because it gives us a contrast to explain why John writes with the contrastive word but at the beginning of chapter 8, verse 1. And I've mentioned John chapter 8, but I'm actually going to make this a smaller section and do chapter 11, and I'll remove the bracket now to look at the text. So I've considered the textual evidence without going into all the Greek language or which manuscripts I'm referring to. Church fathers did not include this section. Augustine justified that it belonged because this passage may actually appear to encourage adultery or not condemn it the way they felt that it should. So I just want to leave this like it is, but just note that I've kept the fullness of what's excluded, what it turns out to be 12 verses if we include this top one. So now, as I've done in the past, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, that's verse 1. And early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. This is the location, this is the timing. So we've got a location of where he was, then he comes back to the temple and he's teaching. Now the event takes place. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery and set her in the center of the court, and they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act." This is a kind of a scandalous statement, because it's obviously in the very act is that they could substantiate without circumstantial evidence that she had actually been engaged in sexual intercourse, and there was evidence from the witnesses that that's what she was doing. So she's been taken by these men and brought to where Jesus was in the temple. Verse 5, "Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say?" They were saying this, testing him, so they might have grounds for accusing him. Now, this verse, I'm going to split it because now we're going to see their challenge. I could leave it as it is because that's the way it is, but I want to set in contrast the opening charge. Although the woman has been brought to Jesus, the woman is under review, and she's under the condemnation of these men, and they are referencing the law that proper action is to stone her for what she was doing. I want to bring their challenge and their motivation to highlight. So I'm going to separate out verse 6 into two parts. And then I want to look at the contrastive response of Jesus. A couple of observations, many more I'm sure you can find on your own, but at least a few to consider at the beginning. There's no dispute, evidently, that she's guilty. And there's no dispute that the law said that you are commanded to stone such a woman. By presenting it to Jesus with their motivation to test him, that they might have grounds for accusing him, they want to use a guilty woman to justify accusing Jesus. These are men looking to judge. They're looking for an opportunity to address someone who is guilty in front of the law, and they want to turn that and challenge Jesus to offer, what do you say? What then do you say? There are two options. The law commanded us to stone such women. If he were to say, well, the law is wrong and deny, then he would be guilty before the Jewish court and denying the word of God as commanded in the law. if he were to say no, then he's gone against Jewish law. Now, if he says yes, that they should stone her, commanded us to stone her, then he goes against Roman law, because they could not take the law into their own hands during this time period and execute their own Mosaic law. Jesus was condemned by the Jews, but it was the Romans who crucified him, and they did it. What they were accusing him of was blasphemy, which was a death by stoning, but Jesus was crucified on a cross, which was a Roman death. So we see a compromise, if there is such a thing, that the Jewish system is set aside by the Romans' authority and death was administered by the Romans. So the Jews are only looking for opinion, and they're looking to solicit an opportunity to condemn Jesus using his own words, as he would disagree with the law or agree with the law and then disagree with the Roman execution. So they've put him, as is often the case, on the horns of a apparent dilemma, and they're looking for a yes or no answer. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. There's no evidence whatsoever about what he wrote. We can only see what the text says, and we see more contrastives. But when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you." Now, I want to focus on verse 7 because it's often ignored. When they persisted in asking him. So it appears to me that I look at this passage that Jesus did not respond to them here. He stooped down and he wrote. Well, I can imagine, what do you say? Yes or no? What do you say? Yes or no? It's either a yes or no question. I can only imagine the inquisitive nature, the persistent nature of these accusers. And he doesn't answer them on their terms. When they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them. It's not a yes or no question, even though that's the way they want to couch it. He changes the nature of the response, and he changes the nature of the conversation and takes it in a completely different direction than they had expected. Seeking a binary answer, it's either yes or no, you're either guilty or you're not. He did something else. And he said to them, "He who is without sin among you." They've been talking about sin. This woman caught in adultery. So now he says, "He who is without sin among you, let him," the sinless person, "be the first to throw a stone at her." The subtlety of this statement is significant. It's profound in the fact that he is not denying the Mosaic law to stone. What he does here is he's challenging who has the right to be the one to throw a stone. They were claiming the law commanded them, and Jesus is saying the standard is to be sinless in order to do what they're doing. Because Jesus knows that this is a test, that they're really not interested in executing the law of Moses and stoning the woman. They're interested in testing Jesus to accuse him. So they're using the woman and they're using the law unjustly. They're not interested in either one. So Jesus changes the standard. He who is without sin among you, he's the one who can throw the stone at her, or the first to throw. This is a game changer. One more fact that needs to be considered. If there was a woman caught in adultery in the very act, where's the man? If she's an adulterer, then so is he. So where's the man? If they're going to claim the law, then they would have brought the man as well. So it's clear that this is a manipulated scene and it's unjust in the way they're going about treating the woman, mocking the law of God by misusing it with the intent to accuse Jesus. So he turns it on them. They're looking to accuse him, and Jesus doesn't point anyone out. He just says, "He who is without sin among you." Somehow, there's a connection between what Jesus wrote on the ground And who is without sin? He bends down again and wrote on the ground for emphasis. When they heard it, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones, and he was left alone and the woman where she was in the center of the court. There are 2 times, John writes, that Jesus straightened up. Jesus straightened up. And I want to separate these out to illustrate 2 things. The first is, number 1, John said it. But I'd like to see 2 cycles. We see the first time that he wrote on the ground, and I want to separate out the second time he wrote on the ground. And I want to show, or at least in my study, I want to see in the face of their persistence, he sets the standard for them to take action. They wanted him to answer them, and he did. He stooped, he wrote, and he straightened, and he spoke. We see it again. He stooped, he wrote. This time we don't see that he straightened up. This time we see that he just says nothing. When they heard it, when they heard what? When they heard the only thing that he said, which is this line. So what's interesting is to see that this is what he said. This is what he did again. But it's when they heard it, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones. So the older men knew something that caused them to leave this trial or this attempt to kill a woman or to accuse Jesus. Evidently, there is something in these 2 sessions of him bending down and writing that was provocative enough for these men to give up the fight. So, having seen, he stooped down and he wrote, he straightened up and he said, he stooped down and he wrote. This time they heard, where he said, now they hear, and they began to go out, beginning with the older ones. He was left alone. Now, I want to separate this out one more time, because where I said he stooped and he stooped, now I want to reverse it, because I think the text does it. There is no second statement he makes here. This one is still hanging in the air. The emphasis is his finger wrote on the ground, and he wrote on the ground. Interesting to note that when Moses commanded us to stone such women, the law had been written by the finger of God, the Father. I think Augustine was one of the first church fathers who noted that the contrast of the law written in stone is contrasted with what Jesus had wrote in the dust. Other church fathers have noted that what was the soft, tender dustiness was in contrast, whatever Jesus had written, is in contrast to the stony, hard hearts of these men. They're seeking justice. They're seeking to execute, or at least get an opinion from Jesus to accuse Jesus. And he reverses it, turns it on them, and then straightening up, he doesn't say anything to them because they're gone. Now he addresses the woman. He's not said a word, didn't ask any questions of her whatsoever. Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you? And she said, no one, Lord. And then the conclusion in verse 11, Jesus said, I do not condemn you either. Go, from now on, sin no more. These short phrase, I just want to make sure we focus on this. Jesus has addressed now the woman face to face. Her accusers are gone. Did no one condemn you? They had said earlier that she had been caught in adultery, the very act. They had given the facts. Expected to stone such women. They had persisted in seeking an answer. But now, there is no one to finish the condemnation. Jesus says the same thing. I do not condemn you either. The law, no doubt, commanded to stone such a woman. Jesus is not setting aside the law as if it's invalid. What he's recognizing in a merciful action, that you are guilty, because he says, go from now on, sin no more. He does not ignore the fact that she's guilty of the act, but he sets aside what is the law's judgment. He doesn't say she's not guilty, but he changes what the law would say in terms of the execution of that guilt. Jesus' words, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Jesus is the only one who is without sin among them, and he forgoes throwing a stone at a guilty woman. He commands her to go, as he did with the lame man. He bids the sinner to rise, or the lame to rise, and now he bids the sinner to go. And he says, stop, sin no more. Jesus does not call it something different. He just changes the judgment that fits the crime. And he offers mercy in the face of this condemnation. It's a fascinating story. It's a graceful story where she, in the midst, and I have to say the midst because it was the center of the court, she's in the midst of a jury. She's in the midst of a prosecutor. And then, as it turns out, she's all alone where she was in the center of the court, and she's with one person. Reminds me very much of the woman at the well. The two of them alone at the beginning of the story, joined by men at the end of the story. Now we see a reversal. A woman being brought to Jesus by men, and at the end of the story, the men are gone in unbelief. And it's Jesus and this woman alone. So it's almost the reversal of that tender story, and both of these are very tender. One more thought, there's many more. This bears a lot further study, like I said early on in this series. I'm not trying to exhaust every single lesson that can be drawn. I want to illustrate what are the major themes to demonstrate the movement of the story so that we can focus in on what are the growing revelation of God's mercy and justice. How that's managed in this story is fascinating. There's one more thing that I'm interested to know, that one by one, beginning with the older ones, they go out. I wonder that these older ones are wiser, and they were giving up the fight. They knew they were beaten. It's possible, only speculation, that Jesus may have written on the ground a list of names and sins. And the ones who are the older ones first recognized they were beaten at their game. Younger ones were later, because they tend to want to stay and fight when the fight is over. They would persist, or maybe they didn't have as much to be ashamed of, or something that Jesus wrote is correlated to the fact that these men leave. And his focal point, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her," would be indicative that whatever he wrote on the ground might well be tied to the sins that these men were guilty of themselves. So the self-righteousness of these men was more important to them than was their real adherence to the law that Moses had commanded. They were using Moses, but they were seeing themselves exempt. It's so easy to fall into that, where people will see themselves as innocent or excused, and they will seek to use the law to condemn others and use Jesus and to manipulate him for their purposes. This is exactly what they do. So by dismantling their argument, they knew, at least the older, the wiser ones recognized, that their motivation was invalid and they were unjust. And Jesus now deals with the act of this woman and addresses that sin and says no more. It's a real picture of grace as a transformational truth in the life of a sinner. There's much more to be said about this story, but for this sake, I'll stop now, and I hope you can enjoy further contemplation on the woman and Jesus.